What you're looking at on the screen is gameplay of an S tier build that requires absolutely no Ubers but can crush everything in the game. In every single clip that you see, I am wearing exactly 0 Ubers, and this build still crushes. I can do 4-man Duriel pretty easily, I can do Nightmare 100 with ease, I can do solo Duriel extremely easily, Varshan, everything in the game just dies to this build. It can even farm Helltides ridiculously efficiently. So what is this build? This is a hybrid between Bone Spear and Corpse Explosion that uses Black River to get gigantic AoEs on Corpse Explosion to obliterate the screen while using Bone Spear as a single target nuke and as a way to consistently tear down elites. This combination allows the build to absolutely crush in both single target and AoE, and I want to give props to my fellow content creator Operator Otter for first popularizing this build. Big shout out to him. But today we're going to be talking about how to play this build with no uniques, how you can get the same results as what you're seeing on the screen, and we're going to be talking about the best way to farm to get to the ultimate late game version of this build, which is an absolute beast. The Deathless Visage actually ends up being very powerful in this build. Not only does it have fantastic stats on it, but it's also going to have that active effect where every time you cast Bone Spear, it's going to spawn a bunch of explosions, and those explosions do quite a bit of damage. And they're going to be proccing the aspect of Exposed Flesh, meaning that they're going to be giving us resource back. Very powerful interaction. On our chest, we're going to be running the aspect of Shielding Storm. This is going to give us a huge amount of barrier off of our Bone Storm, and we end up getting easily 100% uptime on Bone Storm thanks to Lidless Wall. So this is an incredibly powerful effect. And remember, on our chest piece, it's really important that you get 4 damage reduction stats. One of those rolls can be maximum life, but you definitely want to get 4 DR/maximum life rolls. On our gloves, we're going to be running the Splintering aspect. This is going to allow us to apply Vulnerable, and it's going to massively increase the AoE damage of Bone Spear. This is an incredibly important part of the build. On our gloves, you're going to be looking for attack speed, crit chance, lucky hit, and ranks of Bone Spear. On our pants, we want quad damage reduction stats again, but you can see here, I'm changing one of the damage reduction stats to crowd control impairment duration reduction, which just reduces the amount of time that the CCs last on you. This ends up being a very useful thing, and I would definitely suggest it if you have the prerequisite survivability and what you really just want is less crowd control, then it's very good. And on our pants, we're going to be running the Juggernaut's aspect. On our boots, we want movement speed after killing an elite, essence cost reduction, and intelligence. These boots are gigabits. This is definitely what you're looking for. And we're going to be looking for the Windstrikers aspect or the Slaughter aspect for boots. Both are good. There's arguments for both. I think Slaughter is probably generally better because it gives you the movement speed in town, but I'm a big fan of Windstrikers. The Black River is a fantastic unique for this build. The stats on it are tremendously powerful and its effect is insanely good. So remember, all corpse skills is really good because our corpse explosion is actually doing quite a bit of damage in this build, so that is a very useful stat. Then we're getting 2 ranks of Fueled by Death, which is a 6% damage multiplier, and then we're getting 3 ranks of Hued Flesh, which allow us to generate more corpses for bigger corpse explosions. All of that is amazing. And finally, the last effect is really the nail of the coffin, which is that the corpses that you cast Corpse Explosion on will consume additional corpses, which will proc all of your corpse consumption buffs, and it's going to massively increase the size of the AoE and the damage of the Corpse Explosion. This is a huge part of what gives us so much area of effect damage, and you definitely don't want to miss out on Black River. On our necklace, we're running the aspect of Grasping Veins. This is going to give us a huge damage multiplier on both Bone Spear and Corpse Explosion, which is really good. And on our necklace, we're going to be looking for movement speed, cooldown reduction, some sort of damage multiplier like Amplify Damage. And then for the last stat, I'm running crowd-controlled impairment duration reduction, but you could instead change this to ranks of corpse skills for more damage, or, survivability stat, whatever you want to run. That's more of a flex stat. We're going to be running the Sacrilegious Soul, of course. This is going to be auto-casting Corpse Explosions, which will proc the Black River for gigantic Corpse Explosions, and it's going to be auto-casting Corpse Tendrils, which will allow us to constantly group enemies and apply the Grasping Veins buff. On our other ring, we're going to be running the aspect of Exposed Flesh. This is going to give us a huge amount of resource generation, especially in AoE. We have completely infinite resource in AoE, largely because of this aspect, and we're going to be looking for crit chance, lucky hit chance, resource generation, and then some kind of additive damage, and that ring is awesome. Finally, we're going to be running the Lidless Wall, And the Lidless Wall is a very important piece of this build, as it's going to give us a ton of survivability, it's going to give us crit chance, and it's going to give us damage reduction. This makes the Lidless Wall invaluable in this build. Remember, at the end of the video, we're going to be talking about some farming tips so that you can get into the true endgame version of this build with full Ubers. And at that point, I'm going to mention the changes to make if you have some Ubers, so definitely stay tuned for that. But next, let's start talking about the construct. So I am running Genesis and Evernight, and if you consider these to be Ubers, okay, you got me. But I don't really, and the reason is because the drop rate on these is so high. Like, yes, it does take a while to farm out, but to me, it's like leveling your Paragon glyphs. If you just spend the time to do it, it doesn't take that long. So, and as part of my farming advice, we're going to get into that. But definitely, one of your highest priorities in farming should be to get these tuning stones, because they're so freaking strong, and the drop rate is pretty damn high, especially when compared to Ubers. So, we're going to be running Genesis, Duration Support, Tactical Support, Flash of Adrenaline, very classic setup, 50% damage. Then we're going to be running Tempest with Resource Support, Evernight, and Breaking Support. Breaking Support in particular might seem kind of stupid, but remember, in single target, we actually have a lot of problems with vulnerable application, so Breaking Support ends up being extremely powerful. Our skill tree for this build is really interesting. So, we're going to be skipping our basic skill, we don't need it. Then we're going to be taking Bone Spear, going to Paranormal Bone Spear. Remember, 5 points into Bone Spear, of course. And Paranormal Bone Spear is going to give us 5% crit chance, and it's going to give us the additional Bone Shards, which will massively increase both our single target and our AoE. We're putting 3 points into Hued Flesh for the Corpse Generation, which is particularly important against bosses, but even in AoE, this is a welcome thing. We're going to be taking Blood Mist, going to Dreadful Blood Mist. Part of this is for the boss swap that we're going to talk about after the skill tree, because that boss swap with this Blood Mist ends up adding a ton of damage because of Tybalt's Will. We're putting 5 points into Corpse Explosion, going to Plague Corpse Explosions to get the massive AoE Corpse Explosions that have huge multipliers on them. So this is where we're getting so much damage from Corpse Explosion. Then we're putting 1 point into Grim Harvest, which is going to cause all of our corpse consumption to generate resource. And remember, Black River's consuming corpses 5 at a time. So we're getting a ton of corpse consumption. And then we're going to be running Fueled by Death, which is going to give us a damage multiplier after consuming a corpse. 3 points into Death's Embrace. Now, technically, you could make a really strong argument to run Death's Reach instead, but I find a lot of times, if I'm getting Death's Reach, then I'm also getting the AoE on the Splinters, if that makes sense. Because, you know, the Splinters, they reach the maximum distance, the Bone Spear does, then it breaks and the Splinters come back. And when you're proccing Death's Reach, you're also going to be hitting everything with a ton of Splinters, and the extra damage really doesn't matter in those cases because everything's just going to die. So I'm just running Death's Embrace. But there's a big argument for Death's Reach, just so you're aware, and you might want to try that instead. We're putting 3 points into Amplified Damage for the damage multiplier. Then we're running Decrepify with Abhorrent Decrepify for the cooldown reduction, just so we can get a little bit better uptime on Bone Storm. Plus, we're giving a massive damage reduction to enemies. We're applying slows, all kinds of great stuff with Decrepify. We're running Corpse Tendrils, going to Plague Corpse Tendrils for the vulnerable application. So the vulnerable application is going to be really good, especially in AoE, because it's going to make sure that everything in the room is vulnerable. 1 point into Serration, because this effect requires too much essence to be good in this build. 3 points into Compound Fracture, and then 3 points into Avulsion. Those are just huge damage multipliers. 3 points into Inspiring Leader for the attack speed. Remember, attack speed is very important in this build, because the faster we cast, the faster that we can move after we use the spell. Then we're doing 3 points into Standalone and 3 points into Memento Mori, of course. These are very standard in any build that's not running minions. We're doing Bone Storm, Prime Bone Storm, Supreme Bone Storm, 20% crit chance, 15% damage reduction. I mean, who's going to argue with that? And then Ossified Essence for what, for me, is currently a 60% damage multiplier. So, let's talk a little bit more about the bossing swap, because we didn't really talk about that before. So, all we're going to do is we're just going to equip Tybalt's Will, and then we're going to equip a two-handed Serration. And the reason we're doing this is because the two-handed Serration is 80% damage, which is quite a bit. And then the Tybalt's Will allows us to go into Blood Mist, and then exit the Blood Mist, and when we do that, we're going to get 10% increased crit chance. Now, what's cool about this is if you cast a Corpse Tendrils before you go into Blood Mist, then when you come out of Blood Mist, the Corpse Tendrils will proc at the exact same time as you like spam canceling Blood Mist, and you're going to get both the 30% crit chance and the 60% damage, plus you're going to get the 10% crit chance from Blood Mist, and you're going to get the 40% damage multiplier from Tybalt's. And that overlap is how you demolish bosses. So that's the setup for bossing, and that's kind of the rotation there. For the Book of the Dead, we're running Skirmishers for 5% crit chance, Skeletal Mages for 15% against Vulnerable, an Iron Golem for 30% crit damage. We're going to do Paragon board, and then we're going to talk about the tips and tricks and the farming methods that I talked about earlier. But we're going to be running Sacrificial, and we're going to be running it on these armor nodes to make sure that we can reach armor cap. Without all the Ubers, it's a lot harder to hit res cap and armor cap, so we had to make some changes to the board. But we've got Sacrificial here with that setup. We've got Bone Gaft, and we're taking Control for the multiplier against CC'd enemies. And remember, Grasping Veins is constantly CCing enemies, so this is great. We're going to be running Corporeal here. This is going to give us 10% to both the Bone Spears and the Corpse Explosion, so this is really good. And it's also going to buff the magic nodes here, which help us get to res cap. And then we're going to be running Flesh Eater for the 40% damage. And remember, the Black River is going to be constantly eating these huge batches of corpses, so this uptime on this is extremely good. Running Exhumation. So Exhumation is a pretty decent effect because it's going to give us a huge additive damage to our Corpse Explosion. At the same time, it's going to generate us Fortify and damage reduction, so this is really good. Then we're going to be running Scent of Death, which is going to give us a damage multiplier. Typically, because remember, Black River is going to be eating all the corpses, so we're going to get a damage multiplier here. In this last tree, we're going to be running Essence for the 20% crit damage, as well as the 22% multiplier against enemies after they're not healthy. And because our Bone Spear hits enemies and then breaks into shards and comes back, we're going to get a ton of value out of this glyph because the first spear that hits them makes them not healthy, and then the shards all get the bonus damage. So let's talk a bit about farming for this build. And we already kind of talked about it a bit, but the main thing that I want to point out is that once you get all of the uniques for this build, right? Once you farm out all of the kind of minor bosses or whatever you want to call them, to get all these uniques, the second thing that you want to do way before you farm out the Ubers is that you want to farm the Construct. You want to get Genesis, you want to get Evernate, and you want to try to max these out. And by far the best way to farm these is to get in a group to do the Brazzers and then get into a 4-man group to farm the boss. And this is, like, I'm telling you guys, don't waste your time farming Ubers. Do this first. It's going to make your character way stronger, way faster. So make sure you do that. For the tips, make sure that you're always keeping up Bone Storm, at least through Lidless Wall. And remember, if it ever falls off, just play from ranged and be super safe and wait for your cooldown to come back up. But try to keep it up as much as you can through Lidless Wall. You're also going to want to make sure that you're always cursing enemies because you're going to get a huge damage multiplier from Amplified Damage, and you're going to reduce the cooldown of your Bone Storm, and you're going to slow them, which is going to proc some bonus damage. So it's very important. The last tip I'm going to give you is that Bone Spear is ridiculously good for generating corpses. So it's really important against like bosses and stuff to make sure that you're casting corpse tendrils on those corpses that are being spawned so that you can delete the boss. Because remember, the boss is going to get all of the effects of Grasping Veins, so it's really important to corpse tendrils as much as you can, especially in single target and even in AoE. If you are one of those lucky bastards that have some Ubers, let's talk about where they're going to go. So on your helmet, you're going to replace Deathless Visages with Harlequin, and then on your exposed flesh, you're going to replace this with Starless Skies, and then for our bossing setup, you're going to replace the Serration with Grandfather. All of those changes are worth making as soon as you find the respective Uber. But yeah, that's going to do it for today's video, guys. Thank you all for watching. I hope you liked it. A lot of people have been wanting me to do builds with no more Ubers, and I think this is going to be the standard moving forward. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.